All right, so I want to transition over to Andy Caffrey. Andy also is on the ballot. And it's interesting, Andy, Dale, although a Republican and you being, a Democrat, you do agree on the alternative energy. I know that that's true, but you go much further and you are very concerned about climate change and have been really pushing the envelope. Can you tell us about your platform?
Sure. When I get around to writing my memoirs, it's going to open with something like, on the day I was born, I looked out the window, saw the smog, and coughed. Because I grew up in Los Angeles, and until I was 17 and went off to Annapolis, I was exposed to 1,000 or more poison gases, and I feel that's a real violation of my constitutional rights. And so my whole life I was kind of looking around at how do we deal with this stuff, and I saw Jacques Cousteau and Ralph Nader and these sort of charismatic activists. And then, of course, as the 60s wore on, it became much more of a social movements kind of thing. So when I left high school, I wanted to be a marine biologist. I'd taken some special some courses in summer school, and was made an assistant instructor. And we'd go out to the tide pools and out into the ocean, and we'd measure the temperature and salinity every hour to notice the changes. And what you find is, obviously, because a tide pool is isolated, as the day passes, that water is going to get warmer, it's going to evaporate, and it's going to leave more salt in the water, so it becomes saltier. So the creatures that evolved in tide pools developed wider tolerances to these things. The creatures out in the deep ocean, when the sun comes down at noon, that energy is absorbed by the entire world ocean. So those creatures don't develop very wide tolerances, and if you take those fish and put them in a tide pool, they'll die. So I was going to pursue marine biology, and then in college I decided that we had all kinds of scientists doing the work. What we needed to do is figure out how to implement it in society. So my whole adult life's work has been working on well over 1,000 projects, mostly in the environmental realm, but mostly around endangered species, marine biology, whales, forests. I came up here to work on the Headwaters Forest Campaign in 1988. So what's happened is I had a professor at UCSD named Roger Revelle who was the first guy to start measuring atmospheric CO2. He was a president of Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and in 1980 he was telling our class about how fossil fuels were heating up the atmosphere, and it was going to keep on going, and with population expansion, a very dire situation was upon us. So I went, oh my God, that's horrible. The whole society is built on this. What are we going to do? But for some reason, I don't think other people had that reaction. And, well, we have our monkey brains, and we aren't really wired up to be concerned about parts per billion of this or that, or things like ice ages that happened, 16,000 years ago. And that's the kind of stuff you actually have to get into if you want to learn what these limits are, like the tide pool limits for us in terms of the climate crisis. So what's happened is I've worked on it for 34 years. I talked to Al Gore about it when his Earth in the Balance book came out, and back then, David Suzuki had pointed to 3 reports, the IPCC, the EPA, and Woods Hole, all said we had to reduce our emissions 50 to 80% below 1990 levels, and this was in 1990, by 2000 or 2005. And he didn't really say what the or else was. So I then started to explore, well, what is the or else? And then I learned about polar ice. And in 1998, I wrote this paper, the only one apparently anybody wrote, warning about the West Antarctic Ice Sheet disintegrating from global warming and how it would cause a 20-foot sea level increase over 20 years, because I looked in the science and saw that this happened 120,000 years ago. Sea level went up 20 feet and then it plummeted 50 feet in a century. That's 8 inches per year. And apparently the glacial people who knew that you need 10% of the world's ice to cause a 20-foot sea level increase, and there's only 2 places where that exists, West Antarctica and Greenland. Apparently the ocean level people didn't talk to the glacial people because they just said it went up 20 feet. They didn't speculate what it was. And then it was 2009 when the scientific community saw the same pattern a million years ago, and they went, oh my God, this thing, when it goes, it's going to go a foot a year for 20 years. So now we have this news. It's just been announced 3 weeks ago that we're beyond the point of no return. And the way I think people should think of this is the fuse has been lit. This ice shelf is over water, and it's anchored by some islands. And so it's melted back past those islands, and the islands aren't mooring it anymore. That's why it's unstoppable. It's a matter of gravity and warm currents. So this thing is going to go. So it's like the fuse has been lit. And nobody really knows how long it's going to take to get to the dynamite, but everyone agrees that when it does, it's going to be this 20-foot sea level increase. So what's happened is all of this climate inaction, throughout the last 2.5 million years, CO2 went from 170 to 290 parts per million. That's the natural range, like the tide pools for us. Now it's up to 400, and the price we're paying is these climate denialists have now doomed 80 of the 100 biggest cities in the world. There will be no Eureka, there will be no Arcata, there will be no San Rafael. By the end of the century, it's unstoppable. And so my campaign all along has been to try to go where the biggest block of power is, and that's into Congress. That's where the leadership to stay on fossil fuels is happening. Every other country around the world has to sort of keep on using them because the U.S. is using so much. And so I was hoping to get the nation rallied with my campaign last time before we crossed this point of no return. So now what's happened is, and this is sort of like the future of my campaign, is we now have to deal with the climate crisis as a national security issue, and I'm calling on President Obama to start the decommissioning of every coastal nuclear power plant now. Because in Eureka, they started decommissioning that thing 30 years ago. We can't wait until we start to have a foot per year. So I am very excited that I think we're going to have a very powerful anti-nuclear power movement, and we're going to be able to undermine a lot of these hawk Republicans by saying you guys are traitors. They just passed a bill banning the Defense Department from assessing the climate as a national security threat. Can you imagine? It's like, World War II. Well, you guys can assess all of our threats, but don't look at fascism. You guys cannot look at fascism. We'll lock you up if you do. So to me, that's undermining our national security when they're telling the generals, you can't look at this horrendous threat to our nation.
So if you get elected or move forward, obviously, you're addressing a key issue. How would you create consensus to actually create change?
You mean once I'm in Congress?
Yeah, if you're elected to Congress.
Well, first of all, I'm already working on this stuff. 2 years ago, I got on MSNBC and started calling out the president on jailing people for marijuana. I said, no one should spend another hour in jail for marijuana. People should not feel shy or defensive about taking their medicine, and I was thinking mostly of veterans who have to hide it from everyone they know. And thousands of people really suffer when President Obama shuts down the dispensaries. And John Llewellyn and Dr. Courtney and I, we did our protest where I smoked the marijuana joint because we wanted Obama to stop coming down on the dispensaries. And so the Holder announcements are about those three things. They're about ending mandatory minimums for people who are incarcerated for marijuana. It's about the clemency for those already in there to get reduced sentences, and they're backing off on the states. So what I'm doing is I'm starting with new framing, and I actually correspond with every member of Congress and the Senate. And I
on
also,
Twitter, right?
Yeah, on Twitter and by email. And I also contact 300 Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC reporters. And so what I've done is over the last 2 days, I've made a brand new video. It's my sort of ultimate video about how to think about the West Antarctic Ice Sheet threat and what it means for American politics. So I'm basically challenging the Republicans to not be traitors and to get on the side of national security and start to shut down those nuclear power plants or be seen as, essentially traitors. And I'm challenging the president to do that too. So we'll see how that plays out by next January, which is when I would go into power.
Yeah, and Dale, when we're talking about the national security, so this is interesting, tying climate change to national security. A lot of people in the environmental circles have talked about that for a long time. So, and Andy did just mention, bringing Republicans on board or, calling them out as traitors if they don't see it that way. Do you have any comments about climate change as a national security threat?
No, not really. I don't see it that way. I believe that this transition away from fossil fuels has to be somewhat slow because we have so many challenges from other countries, and breaking away from the things that we depend on right now would weaken us, and there are so many who are against us. We can't do it to the extent that we would allow ourselves to be weakened. I'm against the furtherance of fossil fuels, but I don't believe it should be forced on a short-term basis. And
Andy, we were talking a little beforehand, and I had heard before I came here about the notion of in the primaries voting for you, and you said you helped. We're putting this out as well, since Jared Huffman will make it through the primaries, that a vote for you would give you a chance to have a voice in the next step. Is that So that's actually was part of your strategy in a way.
Sure. I've been involved in Green Party politics since 1980 when I helped start the Citizens Party, and then in 1985 the sort of current Green Party situation. And I joined that group the day after I joined Earth First in Berkeley, and I thought I'd spend more of my time with the Greens than with Earth First because I'm kind of a rainbow guy. I'm concerned about all of these issues: war and peace, social justice, poverty, and the environment. But Earth Firsters are the ones who started the Rainforest Action Network, and we went down and started working with the indigenous peoples in these countries, and we also were the ones who launched the first sort of direct action attacks against neoliberalism and globalization. We had a national day of outrage against the World Bank and the investment bankers. And so I basically shifted more into Earth First because they were making things happen. And if you look at like Judy Berry, she brought in the whole labor component. So it just seemed that there was a much better vehicle there. And the Green Party project, however, had the same urgency. In Earth First, we know that if you don't stop the cut by a certain day, they're going to go in and they're going to clear out the forest, and that's it. And so it kind of changes the way you think about things when you have these deadlines. And when I helped some homeless people, there were 3 guys who died before we organized a homeless shelter, and then 3 guys we saved. And, you know, I could have spent I didn't really know these guys. I had PTSD. I connected with them at the until lunch, and, you know, I don't know, I just kind of responded. And I'm losing my train of thought here. But the point is that I could have just watched some new TV series or gotten into some sports thing or done something, you know, for my own pleasure. And it made me very clear about how precious our time is. And so I'm really only about things that are going to get us on this broader project of we have to deal with the climate crisis. We have to get the CO2 levels back down to 280, 290 parts per million as fast as possible, and we have to come together on that. And so I'm using the climate crisis to push for a national campaign to develop bioregional economics, because the easiest way to stop using fossil fuels or nuclear power is to not have to need them. So if you aren't shipping products across the country, but everybody's trying to meet their needs as close to home as possible, you can make giant strides at getting us off fossil fuels really fast.
There were other candidate forums than just here, I assume.
No, there were 2 that I know of. One was the KEAT forum, the League of Women Voters sponsored, and last time, because there were 12 candidates, it wasn't televised. And then there was this sort of candidates night out in Hayfork, which was just every candidate running for anything there gets 5 minutes.
So none of the large metropolitan areas in the districts had those kind of forums.
That's right. 2 years ago, pretty much every progressive Democratic club and League of Women Voters sponsored debates. I was in probably a dozen, and I think I missed 3 or 4 of them.
Do you think that's because they were assuming the results of the election already, or?
Well, yeah. In fact, people have these molds they put, you know, people like Dale and me into, which is they think that we're going to go into Congress to do the same kind of thing that's been done. And as you can tell, I have a much broader project for shaping what I'm doing.
The League of Women Voters
and so these people basically presume that because Dale and I would not have a chance of winning in November, that there is no story to cover. So these people Santa Rosa Press Democrat didn't even know I'd been on MSNBC or that I'd smoked the joint or that Jay Leno had told jokes about me. They just didn't know anything about it, and there was like no curiosity because to them the story wasn't about organizing, wasn't about citizens coming up. I mean, I think it's interesting that 2 guys from Garberville Redway are the only ones,
right.
You know. That's a story to me, and also these climate things. When these things came up, I hammered on the climate in 2012. And about 9 of the candidates moved towards me on the climate. And you would think that when these reports come out, especially since I did write the only report 16 years ago about West Antarctic ice sheets, that these guys would be at least curious to check in with me. But again, to them, the story is who is going to win the 2nd District election in November, and anything about that is kind of whatever, frivolous or
okay.
I just want to say, though, the League of...
Dale,
let
me cut in
okay.
here. Without wanting to knock anyone's campaign platforms, I would say that some of this can be accounted for by the fact that you are the only Republican. And you were right. I mean, that there are voters who want a Republican.
I certainly expected to get the conservative vote.
Yeah, and they're quite clearly voting for that.
They wouldn't vote for a Democrat in general.
Yeah.
Although,
it's
as Dale was saying,
I always saw Dale sort of a guaranteed 21% because that's how much the 2 Republicans got in the 2012 primary.
Uh-huh.
And so the question was, of the other candidates, how would they divide?
How would they? Yeah.
But for me, I always saw that this 20% threshold is where I would have to, meet to surpass Dale.